Okay, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Paul Fagley. I am a historian that lives in Mifflin County. I worked, some of you know me, I worked at Greenwood Furnace as the educator there for 36 years. I retired a couple years ago. And earlier this year, I was asked to do a presentation here. This is one of the programs that I did at the park before I retired. And this is a bit about the Juniata people. Whoop. Went a little too far here. Hold on a second. Go that way. Okay. Hey, come on in. Sit down. So this is a program on who were the Juniata people. Who was this county named after in the valley and businesses and such? Who were these people? And so I was asked that question over many years at the park, and so I started doing some research on it. It's one thing I love to do is research. And I found some interesting things about it, the Juniata people. Start off with, here's a nice little oil painting of the Juniata Valley taken in 1864. But let me switch glasses here. These are just far enough away, I need to get back to my regular ones. But anyway, who were these people, these indigenous people that lived here, that they left only their name to the valley? And let's see if we can learn anything about them. So, this information is on what factual sources are available, but there is some necessary, a little bit of conjecture to it, because we don't know enough to really get a full picture of it. So we put it together as best we can, and the conjecture is based off of what evidence is available. So let's go and search. I mean, pretty sure everyone here knows it's pronounced Juniata, right? Now, I sometimes do this program for people that do not live in the area, and at the park, I often had people there from out of the area come and says, why do you have a river named Juanita? So this is actually in it for them. But it actually, the name is not Spanish in origin. It says not Juanita. It's actually kind of French in origin. It's what the French called these people, so it kind of comes from that. But anyway, let's do a little bit of searching, fact from fiction, or folklore. And why is that? It's because most American Indian history in our area is more in the realm of folklore or stories. We really don't have a lot of factual information. That's because most of the peoples that lived here were here and gone before any European contact. And of course, the indigenous populations didn't have a system of writing or any written languages. What they left was petroglyphs, which are not hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are a picture language like in ancient Egypt. Petroglyphs are just pictures that represent something. They're not an actual language. Some of the information comes from other peoples who may have conquered them or subjugated them. And of course, that information is necessarily biased. It's from the perspective of the victor. And so therefore, you get stories and legends that sometimes substitute for the truth. And this compounds by later historians accepting these without really verifying is there anything to them. So what about archaeology? So can archaeology tell us about these people? Well, in a sense it can. However, in the early 20th century, archaeology was not yet the professional science it is now. Archaeology really started out by basically rich people going out, like in Egypt, and digging and finding things to take back to their house. So it was poorly done at the time and for different motives. Like I said, mostly amateurs. It wasn't until really after World War II with archaeology really became the profession that we know it is today. So evidence was lost or misplaced, maybe due to poor techniques of study or something like that. They excavated in already highly disturbed areas. One thing about archaeology, it's not what you find, it's how you find it, what you find it in relation to. It's what we call context. If it's already a disturbed site, like say, a bulldozer's already did this and you go digging, it doesn't tell you much because it's all disturbed. The context is lost. So the first true archaeological investigation in the Juniata Valley was not until 1957. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. So development in our area over the past couple hundred years has really erased much of what we possibly could learn because they lived in areas that were favorable, so do we. Now there are some published histories. These are some of the major ones of the valley. The first two are very much long on the tail and short on the truth. Africa is a bit better, but because it was various authors, he varies a little bit. Perhaps one of our better sources actually is the history of the Susquehanna and Juniata Valley, which is HSJV if you see it in the program. And Jordan is kind of that netherworld too, where he picks up a lot of the folklore and presents it as fact. However, here's one gentleman which we can recognize for being a good historian. He's actually from Juniata County. How many have ever heard of Professor Gus? Anybody here? Yeah, he lived here in Juniata County, and he wrote a large sections of the history of the Susquehanna and Juniata Valley for Juniata County. And he's very accurate in his writings for the time period. Unlike his contemporary, he avoided that common practice of taking bits and pieces of real information and then embellishing them. One of the best examples of that is, the gentleman's name was Henry Shoemaker. He was the publisher of the Altoona Tribune, and he collected folk tales and published them in his paper and syndicated them to other papers. And it's often said that he had a quote-unquote very colorful and inventive pen. How many of you ever heard of the legend of Princess Nittany over at Penn's Cave? Anybody heard of that? Well, Princess Nittany is 100% out of Henry's mind. Now, it's a totally fictitious story, but he presented it as fact. Just like another one that I'm going to be presenting later this summer, if you like Poe Valley State Park. How many of you think Poe Valley is named after Edgar Allan Poe? That's another Henry myth, Henry Shoemaker myth. And I'll be presenting a program for Poe Valley in July on the origin of the Poe name. And it actually has to do with a military officer in the American Revolution, James Poe. Anyway, he presents a remarkably balanced approach when talking about the local indigenous peoples in that volume. So we can really credit him with a lot of what we do know about them, particularly in the post-contact peoples that lived here, the Tuscaroras particularly, that lived in Juniata County. This, by the way, is the earliest depiction of the Juniata Valley, dating to 1788. But anyway, this again is more for people who are not familiar with the area. This is the Juniata River watershed. Everything that's in there in the light color is the watershed of the river. And the Juniata people lived in what is now the town of Huntingdon. That's where their village was at. So the Juniata River, it's the second largest tributary of the Susquehanna. And of course it joins that river at Duncannon. And it cuts through several mountain ridges and steep water gaps. How many of you know that the Lewistown Narrows is the second deepest gorge in Pennsylvania? Just after the Delaware Watercap Gorge. It's considered scenic along much of its route. 2/3 of it is forested along the riverbanks. It's officially 104 miles long, and that's from its juncture of the Little Juniata and Frankstown branch near Huntington, measured to Duncannon. And of course, the Little Juniata joins it a little further upstream. And it takes in the Racetown branch below Ardenheim. Okay. These are the major tributaries, Tuscarora Creek here in Juniata County being one. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the Paleo peoples that lived in this area. And most of what we know about this comes from either early records or through archaeology. And the dates, I kind of give them in this way. If it's more than 2,000 years ago, it's expressed as years before present, which they like it happened 3,000 years ago. For dates within that, we use the Common Era or AD, which say that was in the year 500. And in America, we don't really call it prehistoric. We refer to it as the Archaic period. Archaic is a word that does mean historic or ancient. And the early peoples in America that are known prior to an identifiable cultural association, that means like the Tuscaroras or the Apache or the Lenape or the Susquehannocks, because we know that those were their cultural associations. They are known in archaeology as Paleo peoples, again, ancient peoples. And the names that we give to these ancient cultures, because we don't know what they called themselves. So archaeology uses the standard where that culture was first identified is what we name them. So like for instance, let's just take an example that there was an archaeology dig here right in McAllisterville, and we found an ancient people. We don't know who they are. So they would be known as a McAllisterville culture. That's how it works. So we have examples. You should know the Clovis people. It's traditionally considered to be the first identifiable culture with the Clovis Point in America. You have the Hopewell, the Adena, the Clemson Island. These are examples. These are not what they called themselves. This is what we refer to them by where they were first identified. And most of those are identified by their pottery and other artifacts that can survive in the ground. That's one thing to understand too. A lot of artifacts don't survive, like foodstuffs or fabrics. So pottery is one of the best things to identify people, because every culture makes their pottery differently. So it becomes very identifiable. And if you find pottery here that has pottery that's identified with this culture over here, it also tells you those two cultures traded. So pottery is often called the handmaiden of archaeology. Now, another thing too is how many of you think that these groups like the Juniatas lived here for hundreds of years? You think that? That's a natural assumption. Archaeology shows that in Pennsylvania, typically they only lived at a particular site for somewhere between 10 and about 35 years, maybe give or take a little bit. And a lot of that has to do with depletion of the resources. The firewood gets used up, they're practicing agriculture, the land gets worn out, they tend to move after that. So these were what we call semi-nomadic peoples. Now, in the Archaic period, this is up to about 3,000 years ago, or about 1,000 BCE. Sorry. I don't know why this keeps shifting on me. Brand new computer. I just got it a couple weeks ago. A second. All right. So, here in the Juniata Valley, based on what archaeology that has been done here, archaeologists estimate that the first peoples came into this region as early as about 15,000 years ago. And that's identified by Sheeprock Shelter. This was a place in Huntington County. It currently is under 80 feet of water of Racetown Lake. But That one has been reliably dated to just under 12,000 years ago. So they probably were here a little bit before that. It's about 15,000 years ago that the ice sheets would have melted enough north. Now they weren't right here, but you were still in that periglacial where it would still be very cold and such. So as they started to retreat, this area would become more habitable about 15,000 years ago. Now, to give you a comparison, have you ever heard of the Metacroft Rock Shelter out in western Pennsylvania? It is actually one of the oldest sites in North America. The archaeologists there are now showing dates at about 19,000 years ago. Most of the archaeological community now accepts dates as early as 15,000 because there's still some controversy over the last 4,000 years. So it's certainly one of the oldest sites on the East Coast and one of the oldest in North America. The first occupants were big game hunters, and they used spears. Now, it's not the bow and arrow that you think of. That came along much later. These are basically spears. The Clovis point is a spear point. They followed the megafauna, the migrations of the animals, such as the woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the smilodons, what we call the saber-toothed tigers, short-faced bear, the bison or buffalo, and such. They followed these as they migrated around, and these animals did historically migrate. Of course, they followed in that tundra region south of the ice sheets as they were retreating. And I said, there's no apparent tribal associations with these people. They're probably family or kinship related. And they passed through seasonally. They weren't year-round residents in the Paleo period, the Archaic period. They were seasonal and semi-nomadic. Mostly peaceful. There's little evidence of confrontations. And that was due to their low population numbers. So anyway, now a little bit about Sheeprock Shelter. It's one of the most important paleo sites in North America. It's considered, with Metacroft Shelter, one of the two diagnostic sites in Pennsylvania for some of the oldest evidence of human occupation in Pennsylvania. It said, along the Juniata River, the Racetown branch, now under 80 feet of water. And it was an overhanging rock ledge. Just think of a big cliff, and then it's hollowed out in the rock ledge like this. And that's where these people lived. And right down in front of it was the Racetown branch of the river. So they were up a little bit from it, so that flooding and stuff, they were above that, but they were like just within a stone's throw of the river. They started excavating this in 1957. Remember I said that was the first professional archaeology in the Juniata Valley? And they dug it literally to the water of Racetown Lake, filled the trenches in 1972. The floor was found to be extremely dry, and it preserved. Remember I said like foodstuffs and fabrics do not survive because of the wetness of our area? Well, under the rock shelter, it never got wet. So those things survived. And they dug as 21 vertical feet is how deep they went with some of the trenches. And that was down to the bedrock of the rock ledge. Yielded over 80,000 artifacts. And they found a fire hearth at the bottom, which was dated at 11,800 years ago. That's how they got the date. And that is through radiocarbon dating. Now in archaeology, that is considered to be a very reliable dating technique for organic remains. So when you often hear of radiocarbon dating, and dates like that, it's very accurate. Now to the public, a lot of people think it's not accurate because of the dating of certain things like the Shroud of Turin, which the dates that they get with it does not what the public believes about it. And I'm not getting into that controversy, but that's just one thing about it, is that some of the public perception is it's not as reliable due to things like that. But actually, in the archaeological world, it's considered a very reliable dating of organic remains. And it only goes back maybe about 30 to 40,000 years. You're not going to date dinosaur bones with radiocarbon. It doesn't doesn't work. It's only for organic stuff in about 35,000 years. So there's a continuous record from about 12,000 years ago up until the 1950s. And some of the artifacts, not just for that, but all the way up to Girl Scout uniform buttons and beer cans from college students that would party there. They also found some skeletons there. There were burials in sheeprock shelter, along with sandals, bone tools, food remnants, bows with strings still attached. Now, they did come in, some of the people who lived there did use the bow and arrow. So remarkable preservation. This is what it looked like when they were digging it before Racetown filled it. These are a few of the artifacts that were found there, such as knives, there's some cordage, some other foodstuffs, and a bark basket. Some of these, I think, are on display in the visitor center up at Racetown Lake. So from about 3,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, we had the woodland period. Sparsely inhabited at this point. They were transient roving groups following the river. Archaeology shows they ate mostly fish. And now they have an improvement over the spear. They use the atlatl, and it's depicted here where they have a short throwing stick. They put the notch on and do it, and it gives much more force to the spear. So that is the atlatl. No evidence of settlements or habitations. And they didn't know, there's no evidence of these people using sheeprock shelter. It's a gap in the record of sheeprock shelter. You come into the late woodland a little over 1,000 years ago to about 500 years ago. These are people from the Ohio Valley. They're moving eastward. These are descended from the Adena and the Hopewell traditions. The period of the Clemson Island culture and Shanks Ferry. These are two cultures identified in Pennsylvania, and the dates are there. They brought with them agriculture, the canoe, and assault of weapons like the bow and arrow. This is when it's introduced in this period. They also made pottery. A lot of pottery is found. Evidence of extensive trade networks. Like, for instance, you find maybe oyster shells in central and western Pennsylvania. Oysters aren't from here, which means they had to have gotten them from a place where they were available and then traded them or transported them. And these were the descendant of the mound builders, and that comes up here next. Here in Juniata County, how many of you are familiar with the Book Indian Mound? Outside of Port Royal, yes. This is the period of that. And although they're not documented, I have seen evidence of other burial mounds around Mifflin, Juniata County area. None of those have been documented or studied. But this is one that was. The PHMC Historical Museum Commission studied it in 1929, just a little over 100 years ago. Found 22 skeletons, pottery, projectile points, and other items. This has been identified based on the pottery to the Clemson Island culture. And it could date back as early as about 1,500 years ago. Which means it predates the Iroquois conquest of Pennsylvania, European contact, and the Tuscarora peoples who lived here at the time. It's one of the oldest late woodland sites in central Pennsylvania. And historically, it was reported to be about 15 feet high and 1/8 of an acre in size. I don't think there's anything left of it today. It's pretty much all gone. So now, around the year 1500 now, we start to refer to this as the contact period. Columbus, 1492, till they get up to the coast into where Pennsylvania is at now. The first Europeans were here, again, give or take a little bit, about the year 1500. At that point, this was how Pennsylvania looked as far as the native peoples. Now, We group these peoples linguistically, which we have two groups. We have the Algonquin language and we have the Iroquoian language. Now, this doesn't mean that they all spoke the same language. This isn't like they spoke English or French. An analogy would be is we speak European language group, okay? What's European language include? English, German, French, Spanish, Italian. Do those people all readily talk to each other using the language? They don't. But they all descend from the same language group. So when we say Algonquin or Iroquois, we're speaking the same thing. It's from a base language, but they may not be able to directly communicate with each other. So the Algonquins' language, that's the Lenape, both the Delaware or the Lenni Lenape and the Munsee Lenape. You have the Shawnee, which moved in from the Ohio Valley, and the Monongahela in western Pennsylvania. The Iroquois, we have the Erie or the Chat, the Susquehannocks, also known as the Andasti, the Conestoga, or the White Minquas. And Minquas is where we get the name Mingos from. The other ones included the Black Minquas. These were mostly displaced Iroquois as wars and disease and stuff kind of decimated them. These were kind of like mostly Seneca and Cayuga and some others that kind of got together, formed what we today refer to as the Mingos. But historically, they were called the Black Minquas. Various other unknown native peoples that had no European contact. And among them are believed to be the Juniata people as an Iroquoian language speaking. And I'll explain how we know that in a moment. So when the Europeans came here, this is kind of how they settled. Up top you have the French represented in purple, the Dutch in New York is red, the Swedes in southeastern Pennsylvania. Swedes were here before the English or the Germans. They're kind of in eastern Pennsylvania. You have the green, English, Virginia, the Maryland colonies, and of course the Spanish is yellow in the south. So this is kind of, with content. Now, before we go to the Juniatas, we're going to talk a little bit about the Susquehannock people because they come into the story. So by 1550, the Susquehannocks lived in the lower Susquehanna Valley. They actually migrated from northern Pennsylvania, the upper waters of the Susquehanna. Eventually, by 1550, they were in the lower Susquehanna. Controlled most of the interior from partway along the Delaware River. You had the Lenape, so there was kind of a gap. And then when you get over towards the Susquehanna, they controlled that, and then most of the interior up to you get to the Allegheny front. And that included the Juniata Valley. Captain Smith, John Smith of the Virginia colony, he met with them in 1608. He said they spoke with a voice from a great vault. When we speak, we use mostly from our mouth. The Susquehannock opened their mouths and spoke in their throat, so it sounded much more vault-like speaking in a room that has a bit of an echo effect to it. He also called them giants. And we think of giants, they must have been 7 feet tall. Of all the burials found in the Susquehannock, the average height of a male was 5 foot 8 inches, about what average height of a male is in America today. About an inch shorter, maybe about 5'9". Anyway, Smith was 5'3". An archaeologist friend of mine said that Smith had a problem with perspective. So I guess if you're this tall, somebody this tall, yeah, they were a giant. So anyway, the Susquehannock is what the English called them from the Powhatans who lived down in Virginia near the colony. The French called them the Andaste. The Pennsylvania English and the Germans called them the Conestoga. and the Dutch called them the white Minquas. And Minquas comes from the Lenape term Minquas, which means treacherous. So they lived in the lower Susquehanna 1550s to the 1760s. Of course, we said they're Iroquoian speaking. There's as many as 20 villages estimated based on what they could be, and maybe a population of around 5,000 to 7,000 is what we believe their culture was. They tended to be fierce, warlike, and good trappers. They are poorly known, but they did have moderate contact with the Europeans, unlike the Juniatas and many others who had no contact. They were wiped out by war and disease and defeated by the Iroquois in 1676. The survivors were taken up to New York as subjects. Several years later, they were allowed to return to their homelands. They came down and settled in Lancaster County in a town called Conestoga, and that's where they were under protection of the colony of Pennsylvania, and the Paskin boys went in 1763 and killed the last of them. Now, there are some who escaped that claim Susquehannock ancestry today, but as a culture, they are now considered extinct. After this, 1676, the Juniata Valley was considered depopulated. And the Iroquois claimed it by right of conquest. And they kept it as a buffer zone because the Iroquois had gotten into wars with the Powhatan and some of the others living down in Maryland and Virginia. In the early 1700s, they allowed other displaced groups to come in. That includes the Shawnee and the Tuscarora. These are not ones who lived here normally. They came as kind of like refugees into this area. And the Lenape, Delaware passed through while they were being pushed westward out of the Delaware Valley. Some of the things the Six Nations complain about squatters in this area. You have burnt cabins, 1750. And of course, during the Treaty of Albany in 1754, the Pennsylvania delegation met with the Iroquois and purchased this area, what we call the Albany Purchase. A year later, you have the infamous Penns Creek Massacre, and then 1756, you have the Battle of Fort Granville at Lewistown. So before I talk now about the Juniatas, is there any questions setting this up? This was to tell you a little bit about what we had here at that time. Any questions on this so far? Okay.
How widespread were the Tuscarora Indians?
They were not very widespread. They tended to concentrate kind of like southern Juniata and into Perry County is where they lived. And they weren't here all that long. And I'll tell you that here in just a moment, a little bit more about them. Any other questions?
Nope.
Oh, yes.
Where did the Tuscarora come from if they were slaves?
I'll tell you that in just a moment.
Okay.
That's part of my talk, okay? Second here. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, what happened is this some reason it's skipping over slides, so I'll go back to this. I'll tell you about the Juniata in just a moment. This was right before the question. So who were the locals after 1700? The first ones that come in this area were the Shawnee. They came in right before 1700, maybe about 1698 or so. And that's Mifflin County, Kishikoquillis is the chief of the Shawnee village of Ohesson, where Lewistown is at. Now, the Tuscarora, they came in here about 1711 and stayed here about 11 years.
Could you pick your...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did. Now, the Tuscarora are actually Iroquois. Now, we think of the Iroquois being up in upstate New York and what they then called the Five Nations. But there were other Iroquois groups who did not join that, and they scattered to different areas. The Tuscaroras went south into the Carolinas and were there for some time. Now, in the early 1700s, they were being pushed out, and they migrated northward, and they settled here in Juniata and Perry counties for that 11-year period. While they were here, they kind of made application, and then they moved up into New York and were admitted back into the Five Nations to become what's now known as the Six Nations. So they are now part of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee, which now they call themselves, up in upstate New York, and that's where the Tuscarora Reservation at. So they're originally from New York, moved south of the Carolinas, came back here, and went back up there. Okay? As I said, the Lenni Lenape passed through here. They did not permanently settle here. And then other than Kishigo-Quillis, we also have another famous American Indian here, Logan, sometimes known as Chief Logan. Used to be a high school named after him. That's where I graduated. It's Logan, sometimes known as Logan the Mingo or Logan the Orator. Even though popularly he's known as a Chief Logan, he was not a chief by their standards. He was more of an outer statesman. He lived outside of Reedsville for about 4 years, 1766, 1771, 4 or 5 years in there. Just if you go up the old road just past Reedsville, there's a historical marker in a house. The basement of the house is Logan's cabin there at Logan Spring. His father was Shekelamy, who lived at Shamokin, and that is the correct pronunciation. For all these years, it was thought to be Shekelemy, but some recent research in the Conrad Weiser papers, he gave the pronunciation, so properly it is Shekelamy. He later moved to the Ohio country and became associated with the Mingos. That's why Chief Logan Mingos. Kind of that loose group of Seneca and Cayuga. And that is where the village was attacked by Daniel Greathouse and the Virginia Long Rifles, and his family was killed. He then precipitated a war, became known as Lord Dunmore's War. Afterwards, he lamented that, and he wrote one of the most famous speeches given by a Native American in American history, Logan's Lament. I don't know it off the top of my head, but generations of school kids did learn it in McGuffey's Readers. If you want to, so just look it up on the internet, Logan's Lament. It was the speech he gave after the war. He refused to attend the peace treaty, but he transmitted that to Thomas Jefferson. Okay, now we get into the Juniatas. Who were they? Well, we know they were a group of American Indians that lived along the Juniata River prior to the year 1700. Their village was at Huntingdon, and in the center of their village they had a tall stone, a standing stone. There is no known contact with any Europeans with them. They had not penetrated this deep into Pennsylvania at the time they lived here, and no European records that they were here. So therefore, they're poorly known and poorly understood. Even as such, they're better known than most of the other groups that lived here that are totally unknown or nearly totally unknown. So at least we know a little bit more about them. Well, what we do know, by 1641, they were forced auxiliaries of the Susquehannock. That's recorded. By the time of the Susquehannock defeat, 1676, they're gone. Of course, before Europeans. Their standing stone, though, remained there for about 100 years after they were gone. It became kind of like a mile marker or something like that in the middle of the wilderness. Several trails came together at it, which is why they're a little bit better remembered than other groups of the same time, because their stone remained. And the peoples knew it. It was seen by early explorers and traders. Sometime around 1754, around the time of the Albany Purchase, the original stone disappeared, and to this day, nobody knows what happened to it. The stories about it, though, are surrounded by mystery and folklore. So, forced auxiliaries, what does that mean? Well, remember I said the Susquehannock were good trappers? Well, they were one of the groups that were involved in what became known as the Beaver Wars. This is that the people of Europe loved beaver skin caps, and so, you had traders and stuff that paid the Indians to go hunt them for their skins. And of course, these tribes warred over territory and stuff about these beavers. So they became known as the Beaver Wars in the mid-1600s. So because their numbers were dwindling due to war, deaths in war, and disease, they would go into these villages and say, hey, you're going to be a part of us. As long as you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. But we need your warriors to fight the Beaver Wars. So they became forced auxiliaries. And probably that's over time they became absorbed into the Susquehannocks and no longer was a distinguished peoples. So what evidence do we have? Mostly oral tradition and the stone. There are no primary sources that talk about them when they lived here. Archaeology. Let's look at this. In Huntingdon County, there are well over 171 sites identified as paleo sites, meaning of the time period that the American Indians lived and the Paleo peoples lived in Huntingdon County. You want to take a guess how many of those are of the Juniata people that have been identified as with the Juniata people? What's that?
Over 100.
Over 100? How about 0? Not one archaeological site has been tied to the Juniata people in Huntingdon County, and that's a shame. A lot of it has to do with their village was underneath the present borough of Huntingdon. There's no place to do archaeology. How about American Indian sources? Huh? Maps? Yeah, maps are a good source, and we'll show you some maps here in just a moment. And they are mentioned briefly in other publications later on. So what's in a name? At the top there, it looks like Onondaga. That's how we would look at that and pronounce it if we just saw that. It's actually pronounced Juniata. That's where we get Juniata from. And Haga is a suffix that means people. When we translate it, Juniata means the people of the standing stone. However, it's likely a reference term. Remember they said they had the standing stone. We have no idea what they called themselves. But they were referred to as the standing stone people. That's why we call them the Juniata. The earliest map to show the name of the river, 1701. The earliest non-river source is a letter by the colonial governor Burnett in 1726. And that's one of the spellings. The modern spelling first appears around 1740. These are just some of the different spellings of Juniata that can be found in colonial records. And the top one we'll talk about in a moment too. Now here's an interesting confirmation. So does this truly mean standing stone people? That's what modern historians say, that's what it means. Well, Professor Gus related this story, and it's published in the History of Susquehanna and Juniata Valleys. He met an educated Wyandot, or Huron, who spoke the Iroquoian language. So he wrote the name on a piece of paper and asked him to translate it, didn't tell him about it. No? People of the mountaintop, the high stony place, the standing rock, starting to get there. Gus asked him, how about standing stone people? Why not? Yeah, excellent translation, he said. Originally mistook Ono as Onan, and Onan meant mountain. So it confirms that the name is preserved in the original translation and name. Other names of it? Some people, historically, with the Ataok, the Iauticas, and the Juniatas are all names associated with them. Ataok. Based on maps, this more likely is a village of the Susquehannock and not a tribal name. Shown on the 1608 Smith map, I'll show you that. Could be considered within the Juniata region, depending on the scale of the map. But no information on this village or the culture. Professor Gus, 19th century, said, nah, this is not the Juniatas. So, let's see. How about Iauticas? If you go to the Wikipedia page on the Juniata, it says it's also known as the Iauticas. First shown on a 1616 map, could be considered within the Juniata region. No information again on this village or culture. Professor Guff examined the possibility. Was it or wasn't it the Juniatas? His conclusion, it's uncertain. Most historians today do say that the Iauticas is an alternate name for Juniata. How about the Juniatas? Also appears to be a tribal name, not a location. Described in 1648 in a description of the province of New Albion. This is where they're mentioned they're forced auxiliaries of the Susquehannock. In the Maryland archives, they're listed. There, it's implied that they're the Oneida, but the Oneida was never that far south. So it talks about two Juniata prisoners. Gus concluded that they were the Juniatas, but did say they could be Oneida. But the thing against it is Oneidas were never forced auxiliaries of the Susquehannock, and these Juniatas were. And then you have a group of displaced peoples living on Duncan's Island near Duncannon. 1745, Reverend Brainerd visits there. He calls them the Juniata. That means some historians say there never was a tribe known as the Juniata at Huntingdon. They were the people on Duncan's Island. Now, they were actually Shawnee, Lenape, Kanoi, and others that kind of living together. How about American Indian sources? Can we tell anything from that? The cultural affiliation is not for certain. Believed to be Iroquoian speaking. This comes from missionaries among the Iroquois up in New York, where they spoke to captives coming out of Pennsylvania. Some of them claimed to be of Juniata people. And they spoke a variation of Iroquoian. This is why we believe that they were Iroquoian language group. If you go to the Oneida Nation website, it considers the Juniata as distant kin of the Oneida. Now in Huntingdon County, the Oneida name is used up there. There's a township up there and also the Oneida district of what was the Boy Scouts. But the Oneida themselves never actually lived there. It was a 19th century association of who they thought the Juniatas and the Oneida might have been the same people. But the Oneida do consider them as part of their culture. Because both the name Oneida and Juniata descend. Remember I said that first word on a different spelling? Both mean standing or projecting stone. So it could be possibly independent of each other. Many American Indian groups call themselves the real people with no ties between them. The Juniatas were known as the keepers of the southern door. Could the Juniatas have been an outpost of the Oneida? Maybe that's why they consider them distant kin. The Oneida stone tradition, the Oneida have this tradition that when they seek a new area to live, they would look for a tall stone standing where none others were around. Again, they're moving their villages around. So when they would scout for a new area, they would look for that stone, or they would take one with them. So was the standing stone an Oneida stone? It's a question we have. Or was their time here inspired by a local geologic landmark? As in Huntington County, what's known as pulpit rocks, standing stones. However, the standing stone is described as being a stone alone with no other stones around it. When the Lenape came to that area in the 1700s, they saw the standing stone called an ashkenik, meaning the large rock standing separate where no other is near, confirming they knew it as an Oneida stone. Conrad Weiser refers to it in that way too, as one stone. So what can maps tell us? Well, the first maps of Pennsylvania, not till 1608, and even then they don't really show much. Of course, Pennsylvania is not founded as a colony till 1682, although the Swedes were here before the Quakers, followed by the Dutch. They were all here before, again, the Quakers. And the colony of Virginia claimed parts of Pennsylvania. They just drew a triangular line right up through much part of the state. The interior was still left to the American Indians of the time. So this is the Virginia colony map, 1590. Now maps back then, today when we look at a map, we assume that north is up on a map because that's usually the way it is. This map, north is kind of like pointing slightly upward towards the top right corner. Right here in the middle, that's the Chesapeake, no, yeah, that's the Chesapeake. Right, and the Susquehanna River going up through the middle. (1608), this is the John Smith map. He only ventured up as far as Port Deposit, Maryland. That's where he met the Susquehanna. And they told him what was upriver. He did this map based on what they told him. Now, we're going to look at this area in close-up. Remember I said the name Adaok? It's pointed out by the yellow arrow. You have Susquehanna right here. That's the modern town where the Susquehanna lived. That was historically was Conestoga. These are the five of the six villages on the map. Given the third or the sixth one is Sepelwig, which is over by Gettysburg or Westminster, Maryland, based on the scale of the map. These are the five along the Susquehanna River. Out of the five, only Susquehanna is known archaeologically. The other ones, we don't know exactly where they were. This is a map showing them where they were located if you take the narrow view. Again, it's the scale of the map, okay? Oh, sorry. If you take the broad view, you can spread them out a little bit. (1614), you have the block map. This is a lithograph of it a little bit later on. You can see down here you have the Minquas, and then I also point out this name Capitanasis. This is an unknown group whose name appears on the map. Nothing is known about them. You can see Long Island and the Hudson River going up through the middle. 1616, this is the first map to show the Ioticas. right there. Look at the top, Capitanassas. See, to use that as a reference point. This is 1639, copied from a map about 9 years earlier. The 9-year earlier map is now lost. This is the first one to show the Juniata name, 1639. If it's based on the earlier map, that means the Juniata people lived here as late as 1630, probably a little bit before that. But it means that they were here by 1630, because this map is based on the 1630 map. Another thing interesting with it too, it shows, okay, wait a second. Yeah, I am right, okay. Here's Adaok. Look up here, Ioticus. This is what I say, based on maps, Ioticus is not the Juniata people. And this is a map that's only in recent years has come to light. These were unknown 20 years ago. 1650, another map. Again, you have the Juniata. Of course, they're shown closer to the Susquehanna River. Back then, they didn't know the Juniata River. This is what's in this area, is what they're being told. You have the Ioticus, he's at Capitanassas above. You have Adaok below, Susquehanna. 1701 is the first map to show the Juniata River, though it's highly stylized. The 1712 map is the first to show Onajuta, the Juniata, not Juniata people. Right there. So this means the people are gone by this time. Again, this is a map 1729. You can see right there on the top left, on a Juniata, but not Haga, no longer referencing the people. By 1749, is showing Kishiko-Quillis, Lewistown, the Hudson village where Lewistown's at. Also, this is the first map to show the name Tuscarora in this area. And somewhere in the northern branch of Susquehanna was a copper mine. Nobody knows where it's at. Geologists have no idea where that's at. 1755, this is a year after the Albany Purchase. Standing Stone is listed. That's at Huntingdon. A year later, the kitchen map, it's showing the monolith. And where it's showing it is interesting. The original Standing Stone. So that's what maps are showing us, is that these people were here. This is the best source we have that they were here. It's again surrounded by folklore. It's at the junction of the Frankstown, Juniata, and Ogwick paths. And it was here about 100 years after the Juniatas were gone. John Harris, the founder of Harrisburg, is the only European eyewitness to record details of the stone. Now, folklore says it was covered with carvings by the Juniatas. John Harris does not say that. And after 1754, the original stone disappears. Now, this is what's interesting. Based on the maps, the Standing Stone would be located within this yellow circle, where Stone Creek comes into the Juniata River just below Huntingdon. According to deeds, the Standing Stone was up where that red box is at. It's supposedly where it stood. So that is an unresolved thing with it. So who likely saw it? These are trappers and traders in the area that likely saw the stone. James LaTorte, 1700s. How about Jack Armstrong, Jack's Mountain? is named after Jack Armstrong. He was murdered in the Narrows up near Mapleton Depot. George Crowan, who later settled at Ogwick, Shirleysburg. And the two bottom, Conrad Weiser and John Harris, are known eyewitnesses to the stone. Those are known. The other ones did not record that they saw it, but they were in the area. They certainly knew of it. Here's John Harris's description. He says it was 14 feet tall and about 6 inches square at the base. Later on, it was said it was only 4 feet tall. That was due to a repair done on the original document that obscured it, but it is actually 14 feet. Conrad Weiser, he's of course the provincial peacekeeper. He recorded in his journal when he traveled to the west that he came within 2 miles of the stone. Well, if he came within 2 miles, how is he a known eyewitness? I'll show you in a moment. There is his journal. It's actually the oldest recorded mention of the stone. And they offered no description of it. But there's something interesting that I discovered. The journal was published as only his trip from his home out to the Ohio Valley. He also kept a journal on the trip back, which for some reason was kept by the family and not published until within the last 20, 30 years or so. So on his way back, he actually says he came to the stone. So that is a reference. He was at the stone. Again, he doesn't describe it. But anyway, so we have two eyewitnesses to the original stone. Well, after people started living there, they erected a second stone in its place. And this is the one that has all the carvings on it. And this is the one that's referenced in Sherman Day, who said it had their carvings on it, like kind of like an Ebenezer or whatever. The Reverend Fithian saw this one. And this one was only 7 feet high. And it was also described by someone else as 9 feet tall. But anyway. But there were modern names, and these were not American Indian petroglyphs or whatever. A piece of that stone does survive in Huntingdon County. Well, the third stone, which is the one if you go to Huntingdon today, is what you'll see. It was erected during the centennial of Huntingdon, 1896, and approximates the size of the original stone. Some claims about the stone to wrap up here, that it had these hieroglyphs on it. Remember I said hieroglyphs, no, Americans did not use them. Sorry, this is doing this again. But anyway, that one's kind of busted. Here's one for you. Now, supposedly the Juniatas and the Tuscaroras got into a war, and the Tuscaroras grabbed the stone and took it down here to Juniata County, and then the Juniatas attacked and took it back. Gus dismisses this story for obvious reasons. First off, they didn't live here at the same time. The Juniatas were gone 50 years before the Tuscaroras moved in here. So there's no way the Juniatas and Tuscaroras fought with each other. So we can bust that one. And then there's also stories about the other Indians coming in and taking it away. Again, folklore. So anyway, that's who the Juniata people were. They were people that lived here, most likely from sometime in the 1620s, were forced auxiliaries and eventually absorbed in the Susquehannocks before the 1670s. We only know them through their name and their stone, which remained here as a marker in the wilderness for about 100 years. So, any questions?
I have an observation, Paul.
What's that?
So I have an observation. If Conrad Weiser was one of the last people to actually physically see the stone,
Don't know. There is this odd story about in the 1940s, a gentleman having a series of dreams where he saw them taking it down, these Indians, and burying it in the floor of a cave. And he claimed that he couldn't get anybody to believe him, so he went and found the cave, dug down, saw the stone. Still couldn't get anybody to believe him. Excuse me. Years later, when Albert Rung, a historian in Huntington County, came across it, the guy was dead. Rung followed his notes, supposedly found out the cave was collapsed on one side, the other side the railroad closed it because they expanded the railroad. Never solved that one. But it's one of those weird folklore things. Yeah, some of the stories are that some Indians came down and took it up to New York or into Canada. If they did, it's not recorded as being there. So it could be in someone's basement, for all we know. Anything else? Well, thanks for being here today.